And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. New government estimates have found the BP oil spill may be spewing twice as much oil into the Gulf of Mexico as previously thought. On Thursday, the Flow Rate Technical Group released its new estimate of 25,000 to 30,000 barrels of oil a day based on information gathered last week before BP installed a new capture device. Some scientists have warned that the flow rate sharply increased after BP cut the pipe known as the riser to install the new device last week. The current estimates from the government panel suggest that an amount equivalent to the Exxon Valdez disaster could be flowing into the Gulf of Mexico every 8 to 10 days. The new numbers were released shortly after a scientist on the Flow Rate Technical Group publicly warned that the oil may be spewing out at a rate of more than 100,000 barrels a day, a figure BP once called its worst-case scenario. As public anger over BP continues to grow, President Obama was questioned on NBC's The Today Show earlier this week about why he had not yet directly spoken to BP CEO Tony Hayward. This was his response when asked what he would do if Hayward was a part of his administration.
He wouldn't be working for me after any of those statements. First of all, we're going to have to find out why this thing went in the first place. And the fact of the matter is that there's going to be a thorough review, and I don't want to prejudge it. But the initial reports indicate that there may be situations in which not only human error was involved, but you also saw some corner cutting in terms of safety, and that BP is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. It's talking about paying $10.5 billion in dividends just for this quarter.
Right.
We are going to have to make sure that not only do they shut down the cap, we are not only going to have to make sure that any deep well drilling process that's out there is in fact fail-safe, and oil companies know what they're doing, but we also have to make sure that every single person who's been affected by this is properly compensated and made whole.
Well, President Obama might now have some harsh words for BP, but an extensive new investigation into his administration's handling of the disaster reveals it was government mismanagement, delays, and absence of oversight that allowed the crisis to spiral out of control. The article is called The Spill, the Scandal, and the President. It's published in the latest Rolling Stone. Author Tim Dickinson is a political correspondent for Rolling Stone magazine. He writes, quote, though George W. Bush paved the way for the catastrophe, it was Obama who gave BP the green light to drill, and explores how Interior Secretary Ken Salazar kept in place the oil industry-friendly environmental guidelines that Bush had implemented and ultimately let BP, an oil company with the worst safety record, to get away with murder. Tim Dickinson joins us now from San Francisco. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Tim. What surprised you most about your investigation?
That's a tough one. There's a lot of doozies in here. I think just the fact I had written a fairly credulous piece about Ken Salazar when he came in, was appointed with his white hat and his bolo tie and declared himself to be the new sheriff in town. And we had talked very specifically about his intent to clean up MMS. And in fact, one of the first things that he did upon taking office was go to MMS and bust chops and say, listen, this behavior that's been going on for all these years isn't going to fly anymore. And Salazar had assured me personally that this was not just about ethics reforms. This was, deep, thoroughgoing reform. But it turned out that I think the thing that was most surprising is that Ken Salazar, in the first year in office, put a record number of acres up for lease in the Gulf. So while they were taking drilling out of view of national parks on land and scaling back the oil shale development, they were throttling up offshore oil drilling to record levels without doing this substantive reform that would have been required to make MMS something other than a candy store for the oil companies.
But Tim Dickinson, as you also note, it should not have come as a surprise because Salazar already had a record while in the Senate of backing a greater exploration offshore. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, he had back in 2006 opened up 8 million acres of the Gulf through a bill that he sponsored, and he had pushed President Bush to make oil companies develop their existing leases more quickly. And someone described this to me, that there's sort of an onshore Ken and an offshore Ken Salazar, and he has a very sort of highly specific soft spot for offshore drilling. And I can't account for what that's about exactly, except that as a Westerner, I think he's sort of more acutely aware of the damage that development can do to the landscape, and maybe this is a way he's seen as to create create the problem someplace else other than in his beloved Western landscape.
Tim, start where you start on May 27th. It's like a month into the oil spill, and you have President Obama striding into the podium of the East Room. Take it from there and then trace back the responsibility.
Well, so Obama stood up and said, we take response. The buck stops with me, essentially, is what he said. He said that the reforms at MMS hadn't been urgent enough and that he took responsibility for that. And he said that, my biggest fault was sort of taking the oil companies at their word that they knew what they were doing and had a worst-case scenario plan. But as it turns out, that's not just something that Obama should have been taking the word of the oil companies for. But MMS, in fact, is responsible for reviewing the worst-case scenario cleanup plans of these oil companies. And in BP's case, BP talks about protecting walruses in the Gulf in their cleanup plan. And they have a cleanup plan that is supposed to be good for a spill of 250,000 barrels a day. That is to say, in Exxon Valdez, every day, they claim the capacity to significantly address the cleanup from a spill of that size, and it's just ridiculous. It's laughable. And so there was no oversight in terms of the cleanup end of this. And then in terms of so Obama and Salazar take over. They go in eyes wide open. And they say, okay, we know that there's a problem here. And the ownership of this actually starts in sort of an admirable place. Even before Obama took office, he said, this is my great friend Ken Salazar, and he's going to come in and make sure that Interior is much more than a service company for the special interests. And Ken Salazar puts on the white hat and says there's a new sheriff in town and goes about sort of trying to clean up an agency that had descended into rank criminality, and MMS staff partying with oil staff, oil company officials, and doing drugs with them. The corruption at this agency is really sort of hard to overstate. But what Ken Salazar did, he has a chief of staff who's a former attorney general with Colorado, and they sort of cleaned up the rank criminality bit, but the reform didn't go any farther than that. So they left in place top managers who'd risen through the ranks in this incredibly pro-development oil culture, such that on the day that Ken Salazar announced his reforms of MMS, in the Alaska office, they served a cake that says "Drill, baby, drill" on it. And so this is the rot at MMS extends far beyond what was a criminal problem, and it goes to managers who only get promoted if they sort of suppress science and fast-track drilling. And so that's the culture of this place, and which is a long-standing problem. But they had promised to clean it up, and then, but instead of doing that, they like I said, they started to just throttle up offshore drilling to unprecedented levels. And